for the second presentation from Women and Gender Constituency.
Thank you very much, Your Excellencies, and dear colleagues and friends, for the opportunity to speak here on behalf of the Women and Gender Constituency. I want to point out that the input for the presentation, and we do have a PowerPoint, was actually sourced collectively from a number of civil society colleagues across some constituencies, including from ENGO constituencies. Next slide, please. So we wanted to particularly point out that private capital cannot be leveraged or de-risked with public monies at the scale that is necessary to deliver an ambitious climate action. And I think this is the framing for the NCQG with which many of our constituencies, of rights-based constituencies, go into the NCQG discourses. Instead, new and additional public funding can and should shift us from the billions to the trillions. The required innovation is reform of an unjust and inefficient global financial system. So this is a systemic issue. It's not just a matter of raising more money. These reforms can also contribute to setting up a macroeconomic system where the cost of private capital in developing countries is reduced, particularly with a view towards the base of the pyramid and facilitating and enhancing and simplifying direct access for communities and indigenous peoples, as we have heard. Next slide, please. So we want to start out, while everybody is focusing on private sector mobilization, to be a little bit more realistic about the limits of private sector finance for the action. And you can see here some acknowledgement by a paper from the IMF where it actually says greater private finance, particularly for infrastructure and related action, exposes poor households to higher service costs. And that's something to be kept in mind as we are talking about mobilizing private sector. So MDBs and government are called to use public resources to de-risk and attract private investors for climate projects, and there is a lot of discourse about guarantees, private blended finance, public-private partnership. But we also need to be and acknowledge that they very often leave developing country public sector with more debt and more risk, which can ultimately harm communities. Therefore, MDB reform is necessary. Institutions like the World Bank are planning to focus mostly on the strategy of delivering more private finance. However, there is a problem with this so-called cascade approach. Namely, it reduces important amounts of public finance that could go directly to finance high-quality public services and private and adaptation measures that should be grant financed. Also, there is a profit motive of the capital of the private sector and the desire of wealth generation, and this is the reason why it's mostly for mitigation. And there is a commensurate lack of interest of most of these private investors to fund climate resilience, adaptation measures, and loss and damage, but those are the priorities that the most climate vulnerable developing countries have. Next slide, please. And even when you go to renewable energy, for example, and blended finance approaches, we see that it often doesn't deliver at the scale that is necessary. So concessional public finance meant for leveraging renewable energy projects attracts more often other public finance than it does private finance. And this slide actually showcases that. What you're seeing in blue here at the bottom is the quote-unquote real private finance. The rest is public finance, which leverages each other basically for a blended finance approach. Next slide. So what we want to look at from the rights-based constituency is actually raising public revenues to tax justice. And that must include taxing polluters and those with an excessive ecological footprint. There is a huge, on a personal level, person-to-person and equity element included here. Taxes should be progressive, feminist, decolonial, and ecologically just. And our tax system should prevent cross-border tax abuse, such as avoidance and evasion, through greater tax and financial transparency. And civil society advocates have put forward what actually tax justice means by focusing on those 5 functions that taxes have to perform. And I'm just mentioning them quickly. You see it on the slide: revenues, distribution, repricing, representation, and importantly, reparations. Next slide, please. So there is another way to mobilize trillions, to shift us from the billions to the trillions, and particularly when we are looking at tax, 4 action steps are needed. First, expanding the tax to GDP ratios in the existing Annex II rich, high-polluting countries through progressive, gender-responsive, and climate-sensitive tax reform that could raise up to 2.15 trillion every year. Also changing how global tax rules are set and enforced. And there has been a long-standing call for a new UN framework convention on tax. Then enabling climate vulnerable countries to expand their own tax to GDP ratios through progressive reforms to actually reverse decades of austerity so that countries can reclaim sovereignty over economic policies and achieve their own climate commitments, as well as be well placed to use international climate finance. And taking coordinated action globally to introduce a range of new finances that could raise trillions, again, not billions, of US dollars. The next slide, please. So you've probably heard some of those. I will not go through the numbers in detail, but you see them on a screen. There are many available measures for countries to raise public funds. They start with the simplest: stop funding fossil fuels, make polluters pay. For example, there have been proposals out there for a climate damages tax on fossil fuel extraction. Then there is discussion about taxation on aviation and maritime shipping, and again, all of those have to be progressive. They need to take the no incidence for developing countries, and particularly the most vulnerable developing countries, into account. We need a higher minimum corporate tax rate. We need to discuss seriously wealth taxes on multimillionaires and billionaires. We need to crack down on tax evasion. Next slide, please. Financial transaction tax. It's already implemented in many settings, sometimes in a country or regionally, but could be expanded globally. We should think of redistributing at least 20% of public money that is currently used for military spending. And new issuance and redistribution of SDRs. Cancel debt payments in low and middle income countries. And if you add all of those up, alone in the global north, in the Annex II countries, you would come to close to 5 trillion per year. So this is the 5 trillion that would go a really long way towards what we need in the NCQG as the public provision and delivery goal. Next slide, please. Then what are some of the cost barriers that developing countries are facing? Indeed, their borrowing cost is on average 3 times higher than developed countries. And that slide is just an illustration. It's very important to also understand that for every $10 paid in interest by developing countries, at least an additional $1 will be spent due to climate vulnerability. So the climate vulnerability, the increase in climate vulnerability increases even further the cost of borrowing for developing countries. Next slide, please. So what are some of the ways of reducing the cost of capitals? On the country level, it's aligning all finance with climate action and the Sustainable Development Goals as part of efficiency. And you see here that quote from Mahmoud Mohildeen, the Special Envoy on Financing for the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, where he says, commercial capital will be attracted more easily to economies with a strong vision and clear strategy for achieving the SDGs, and I would include for progressive climate action. So what do we need to do on the global financial architecture? Meet official development assistance commitment, expand MDB lending through improved terms, special drawing rights and capacity support to national institutions, actually urge all lenders to commit to responsible lending and borrowing principles, lengthen the time horizons of credit ratings and debt sustainability assessments, address debt sustainability to debt cancellation. A short suspension clause is not enough. And we also need particularly a UN-based multilateral sovereign debt restructuring mechanism. Next slide, please. A quick example on reducing the cost of capital. I think one important action, very often not given enough to, and particularly important with respect to gender responsiveness, is the focus on and enabling efficient investment in micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises by, and this is very important, addressing gender equality and discrimination, because we see a lot of inaccessibility of financing, even green financing that is supposed to be accessible to those MSMEs for women-led or women-owned businesses. We need to lower the cost of sending remittances, because this is a key counter-cyclical influx of funds, and we need support for opportunities for local manufacturers, producers, and sellers to be part of project implementation in meaningful ways, as opposed to prioritizing expensive international project implementers. And this is even more so the case when we are continuing to have a climate finance definition or non-definition that includes financing through export credit agencies, where the express purpose is not to have local or domestic manufacturing capacity providing goods and services, but the country that provides the funding in the first place. And with this, I come to the last slide, addressing some of the other, next slide please, I'm sorry. Addressing some of the other inequities in the global financial system that need required reforms because they impact developing countries' climate action and cost of capital. And that means we really should stop with austerity measures, reduce austerity measures, because they prevent countries from investment in climate action and SDG implementation for the most impacted who rely on public services. This has highly gendered impact, because when public services are cut, women very often bear the brunt of non-service delivery. Under the International Investor-State Dispute Settlement regime, 70% of claims, almost all from high-income countries, are against developing countries, and that often constrains their ability for climate action. And lastly, credit rating agencies make environmentally sound policies often very costly. We had several examples. We had the Yasuni decision in Ecuador of leaving fossil fuels in the ground that led to a dropped rating for the credit rating agencies, by the credit rating agencies. Same for Colombia, when it announced that it plans to stop coal extraction, and it was penalized by the financial markets. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Madam Schalatek, and I'd like